Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 Quick Match gameplay. So here we are in the Chaos Wastes for Empire Civil War. So both of our factions, or forces, are in some ways similar, in some ways very different. So we are going to go over what's going on here. One of the interesting things I've found in my time playing Total War Warhammer. It's actually pretty difficult to get mirror matchups. Oftentimes players will switch off if you are playing the same faction as them. In this situation, both me and my opponent selected Empire very quickly. So and both stuck with it, so it's pretty cool. You don't see mirror matchups very often, so it's always fun to get to try that out. So for my lord, I did bring the mighty Boris Todbringer, and Boris, of course, has some pretty crazy debuffs. He's got the good old Midland Runefang for that replenishment. He's got Crush the Weak for a nice little debuff there, and the White Cloak of Ulrich, meaning he can drop down an enemy melee attack by up to 14, as well as debuffing enemy melee defense by 4, and leadership by 4 as well. Once your enemies are below 50% leadership to begin with. I did not manage to get Deadly Onslaught on him this time around. There simply wasn't enough money. But I did get Foe Seeker, so he can potentially, if needed, get out of a bad situation. Alongside him, I did bring a Grey Wizard over here, and you can see the Grey Wizard. Not a great melee combatant, of course, he is a caster and all that, but I did give him a few items. I did give him the Power Stone, and I gave him 2 spells, the Penumbral Pendulum, which can be very good against a lot more lightly armored up faction that tends to line up like Empire. Does tend to have pretty concrete battle lines, and Enfeebling Foe to debuff specific targets and make them slightly easier. Apologies there for the cough. Slightly easier targets for units such as my Demigryphs. In the front line, we do have a whole bunch of unbreakable units, figuring that Empire might bring some shooting, and they definitely might whittle them down very heavily with shooting, because most of these guys aren't shielded, but thinking Flagellants, Tattersouls, all those sorts of units can crush most Empire infantry very effectively. They can definitely trash swordsmen, spearmen, halberdiers, all that sort of stuff. Only greatswords will give them massive amounts of trouble, but for that, I do have some solutions in the backline. I also do have 3 units of spears covering my flanks, because Empire can go very heavy into cavalry, and I want to be prepared to defend my shooting contingent, which is really here to do a lot of damage, including Sterling's Revenge and the Silver Bullets to shut down enemy heavy armor, especially if my opponent, for example, brings greatswords, as well as 2 crossbowmen, because the crossbows do have range, and they can peck away at enemy crossbows, they can pick away at enemy flagellants, or that sort of stuff. And they still have an okay armor-piercing punch. I do believe they have 3 or 4 armor-piercing damage. 3 armor-piercing damage. They can, with focus fire, they can do a little bit to heavily armored targets as well. In the backline, we also have a major cavalry contingent, the Royal Altdorf Griffites, as well as Demigryph Knights with halberds, and these guys can really tear through enemy armor and deal with enemy heavy cavalry if needed. Now, for my opponent, his composition is actually in some ways similar, in some ways very different, as mentioned before. For his lord, he did bring a General of the Empire, so definitely going a little stingy or cheap here. Just definitely had to make room for some of the other items. That said, the General of the Empire does have the Charmed Shield, which gives him a decent ward save of 22% and a better missile parry. And he does have the Blood Roar, which is an -8 leadership debuff when he dives into combat. Unfortunately, that's not going to help him very much against the unbreakable front line I have here. That said, the General of the Empire, while definitely not having comparable stats to Boris, is cheaper. So definitely that is a little bit in his favor. Down on the ground, he does have a Lore of Light Wizard with the Net of Mintok as a cheap spell, as well as False Protection for those slight buffs to his allies, and of course Power Stone to improve power reserves and power recharge rate. So definitely some very potential for some great snares, and really potential to shut me down with his heavy cavalry in the back here. In his front line, my opponent has a whole bunch of veteran up swordsmen. These guys do have very good stats, and I do believe they can perform somewhat comparably to Flagellants, actually, when they're this roided up. They have the benefit of shield, so they'll be much more resistant against my shooting. Out on the flanks, he is anchored by flagellants, who of course will not break and will still tear through. And a flagellant will be a pretty grim meeting, definitely offer mass slaughter. In the back line, 3 units of crossbows to shut down my squishier units. Definitely, these guys are very potent against Empire infantry, and with such a completely unarmored front an unshielded front line, these guys can do some massive work against the Tattersouls and flagellants. Down on the ground, he does have 2 units of Demigryph Knights with halberds, not quite on par with my Royal Altdorf Griffites and Demigryph Knights with halberds, of course. These guys are a bit cheaper. Well, one of the units is of course a bit cheaper. They don't have the 9 veterancy, but depending on who gets the charge bonus off, these guys can still perform very well. And of course, they do still offer a comparable backline protection. In the back, he does have a single unit of spearmen covering the rear, and the Temploff Luminarch, which is really the main kind of beefy portion of his army here. My opponent gave up on the armor-piercing shooting in favor of getting the Temploff Luminarch to potentially get Lord Sniping, as well as an additional Net of a Mintok to tie my troops down. You can see now, throwing things into full gear, we are marching straight forward. I don't intend to dilly-dally and slow the engagement time down by much. and so we are gap closing as quickly as we can. As you can see, my opponent is getting set up. He did get his battle lines up, and I'm pushing straight in with my squishier units. You can see the Tattersouls are taking massive fire from those crossbows, losing thousands of HP in just a single volley. Into my turn, I'm using my handguns to fire on the flagellants because they do have this little gap here, and the Sterling's Revenge is firing into the flagellants here as well. And while, of course, not really meant for this kind of to deal with this sort of infantry, they can do a good amount of damage because they're unshielded. With the spears thrown into the fray, these guys will be tied down and won't be able to push through. Meantime, my demigryphs are flanking. You can see I'm definitely not giving up the flanks and just pushing in just to apply some pressure to my opponent's troops. Unfortunately, you can see the Templar of Luminarch here is charging up, even as I do drop an overcast Penumbral Pendulum, nuking down these crossbowmen by a significant amount. In the meantime, Boris has managed to evade the shot there from the Templar of Luminarch and plows into the back of these swordsmen. I'm not entirely sure which Net of Mintok is being cast here, if it's the one from the Light Wizard or the one from the Templar of Luminarch. But either way, my opponent does get a full charge off on the Royal of Griffites, and the only thing that is really saving them here is that I have debuffed the enemy Griffites with Enfeebling Foe. Stacked on top of these spears, my opponent's demigryphs will go down very, very quickly. Over here on the flank, you can see my demigryphs are still sitting around, kind of waiting. My opponent is keeping his demigryphs here, covering himself, even as my crossbows are slowly but surely eating away at his rear line and dealing with his crossbows. Of course, with the help of that Penumbral Pendulum, I was able to even up the crossbow duel, and my handguns are, of course, still firing away, trying to chip away this General of the Empire, even as he does pursue my Grey Wizard. Over here, the Demigryph Knights are done. I do make a feign a charge here against the Spearmen, then pull the Royal of Griffites out of the way at the last second and allow the Spearmen to push through to tie down the enemy spears. The Flagellants are doing okay. You can see they're getting torn apart by the Sigmar Sons, who are just superior. Unfortunately, these Flagellants are dying. A lot of them did get shot up and that sort of stuff, so definitely not the best there. Over here, you can see the Demigryph Knights with Halberds are slugging out with my Demigryph Knights with Halberds, but my opponent does get a Phos protection off on his Demigryph Knights, which is going to swing the tide very much in their favor, as I'm not quite able to get Sterling's Revenge into range to fire. Over here, you can see the Flagellants are tied down by the Spears. The Spears are doing surprisingly well against Flagellants. Definitely, I was a little impressed given how cheap Spears are. The crossbows still firing away, trying to whittle down this Light Wizard because I don't really have much else for them to shoot at. In the meantime, the Royal of Griffites are tearing through the Temple of Luminarch, which has no real protection in melee with its terrible melee stats. Over here, Boris has managed to recover, and I have managed to shoot down the Lord with my silver bullets. You can see he's lying over there, gunned down, and the Grey Wizard has managed to return. I'm definitely looking to be pretty strong. The Demigryph Knights with Halberds are very badly beat up. Unfortunately, my opponent is getting a brutal charge here on my Royal of Griffites with his own Demigryph Knights, and the Royal of Griffites being tied down fighting the Temple of Luminarch. Still worthwhile though, and I do drop a Enfeebling Foe on these Demigryph Knights, evening things up a little bit for the Royal of Griffites, who would otherwise get completely stomped. As it is, the Royal of Griffites will most likely not win this engagement because they are just so badly whittled down, but they will be able to hit a little more effectively in return. In the meantime, Flagellants have busted these swordsmen. You can see the spears are actually winning against the Flagellants back there, and the swordsmen are simply tying them down with my crossbows while pulling some Flagellants back, using the other unit of crossbows to whittle them down and dealing with them that way. These swordsmen are being tied down by spears, so definitely my massive infantry is ensuring that even though I didn't quite win the front line fight in all places, I'm able to plug holes up. Grey Wizard pushing through. You can't see another Temple of Luminarch or another net does go down, but I am able to snipe down these crossbows with another pendulum, and my opponent's army does at this point shatter due to army losses, leaving only this handful of Flagellants here, but my opponent will GG out before, rather than dragging the game out. So Pyrrhic victory for the Empire against the Empire. I don't think there's any other way it could have gone. There were definitely, I think both of us had, in some ways, a similar idea of what we wanted to do. The biggest difference was when my opponent decided to bring a Temple of Luminarch to kind of snipe away at Lords, whereas I decided to settle for armor piercing. I think the Temple of Luminarch is not really worth bringing against Empire, because Empire can bring some more hard-to-hit Lords, and they can get Lore of Life, and the Temple of Luminarch is not particularly good against bigger or more numerous armored units, like Great Swords or Demigryph Knights, and of course Great Swords. I was debating bringing a unit of Great Swords, for example, in this matchup, just to swing that frontline fight more in my favor. As far as the front lines go, the Flagellants and the Sigmar Sons and Tattersouls and all of them performed rather well, though they were definitely disadvantaged by the fact they got shot down so much by crossbows. Crossbows are definitely no pushovers in the Empire on Empire matchup. The Demigryph Knights, my opponent got a great charge off on the Royal of Griffites, which really swung the tide in his favor in that engagement, which really should have rather been an engagement in my favor. I managed to essentially lose an engagement I could have easily, or won much more handily. The Grey Wizard proved incredibly useful with the Pendulum. Boris Todbringer did not do very much. In fact, he got gunned down by the Temple of Luminarch and chased off the field, and only came back towards the later stages of the game. Similarly for my opponent, the general of the Empire was simply not able to shut down the back line. My opponent, due to the fact that our cavalry forces were so evenly matched, it was very difficult for either side to really get into the back line. I did have a few extra spears, and I think what really came out winning this matchup was the fact that I had that extra damage output from the Grey Wizard, stacked on top of the fact that I had spearmen to plug holes up and shore up the gaps in the line that were being opened up by my opponent's mostly winning infantry force. Since in a lot of places my opponent definitely won out against the Flagellants, since of course the veteran swordsmen are very efficient in that, and with the exception of the Sigmar sons, they were just doing much better. So I definitely think a big part of the reason for the win there was the help from the Grey Wizard, debuffing my opponent's troops, as well as the shooting. I was just much more effective, I think, at shutting down my opponent's shooting power. Nonetheless, it definitely was a great victory. You can see that just a very good game for my opponent here, for the Franco TW. Like I said before, the only criticism I really have of his build is Temple of Luminarch. I think there's much better ways you can invest 2,000 gold as Empire if you're fighting as another Empire faction. And I think something similar to what I did with the doubled up armor-piercing stalking units would have probably been a better deal. Regardless, good game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below. If you have any comments, criticism, any questions about the game or anything like that, be sure to leave them down in the comment section. I will respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Wyvern out.